The airplane hummed steadily at 30,000 feet, sunlight spilling warmly through the wide cabin windows. First class was calm, soft conversations, clinking glasses, and the faint shuffle of newspapers. I had taken my seat quietly, blending in like I always did. Nobody ever suspected me. That was the point. My job required silence, alertness, and the ability to remain invisible until I wasn't. But silence broke when the sharp voice of a woman cut through the ease of the cabin. Her eyes found me instantly, filled with judgment before she even knew my name. "People like you," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, "shouldn't be sitting in first class." The words stung not because they held truth, but because they carried the weight of ignorance, the assumption that worthiness could be measured by looks, dress, or the color of skin. Heads turned, passengers stared, and for a second, it was as if all of first class froze, waiting to see how I would respond. I could have stayed quiet. I could have swallowed the insult and let her bask in her false superiority. But sometimes silence allows arrogance to grow, and sometimes the truth deserves to be seen. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I was the one tasked with protecting every soul on this plane, including hers. Her words had stripped the moment bare, but what would follow would strip away her pride. She thought she was putting me in my place, but she had no idea who she had just spoken to. And before this flight was over, the entire cabin would find out exactly why she had chosen the wrong passenger to challenge. The morning sun poured through the enormous glass walls of the airport, scattering bright golden light across the polished floors. Travelers hurried in every direction, families dragging tired children, businessmen glued to their phones, and tourists weighed down with backpacks and excitement. The air was alive with the hum of rolling suitcases, boarding announcements echoing from speakers, and the occasional sharp cry of a restless child. To most people, it was chaos. To me, it was order. Every movement, every voice, every sudden change in rhythm meant something, and it was my job to notice. I moved through the terminal with ease, blending into the crowd, neither rushing nor lagging behind. I looked like any other traveler, plainclothes, no flashy watch, no loud accessories. I carried one small bag and kept my pace steady. Two strangers. I was invisible, just another face on the way to another destination. That was exactly the way I wanted it. When the boarding call for my flight was announced, people rushed toward the gate like water spilling from a broken dam. I followed at my own rhythm.com/controlled, eyes always scanning. At the gate, a cheerful attendant scanned my boarding pass and directed me toward the jet bridge. I gave her a polite nod, stepped forward, and let the stream of passengers carry me onto the plane. The cabin smelled faintly of leather and coffee as I entered first class. Sunlight streamed in through the large oval windows, bathing the seats in a warm glow. The space was quiet, only a few murmurs here and there, the rustling of newspapers, the sound of ice clinking in a glass. It was the calm before the flight, the moment when everyone was still settling in, adjusting pillows, sliding laptops into seat pockets, and deciding what to order once the attendants came around. I slipped into my assigned seat, second row from the front. It was wide and comfortable, with enough room to stretch my legs. But comfort wasn't what mattered. From here I had a clear line of sight to both the cockpit door and most of the cabin. I could see who stood, who sat, who moved with purpose, and who carried tension in their steps. Every detail mattered. I buckled my seatbelt, leaned back slightly, and pretended to relax like any other passenger. In reality, my eyes moved constantly. The elderly man 2 rows behind me was nervous. Not dangerous. His hands shook as he tried to fit his bag into the overhead compartment. The couple across the aisle whispered quietly, more interested in each other than in anything else. 2 businessmen sat near the front, already tapping on their tablets as if time was money they couldn't afford to waste. For a moment, everything seemed perfectly normal. Then she entered. Her heels clicked sharply against the cabin floor as she stepped into first class, pulling a glossy designer handbag behind her. Her blonde hair was styled perfectly, her jewelry glittered even in the daylight, and her lips curled into a frown as she scanned the rows of seats. She didn't look around with the curiosity of a traveler. She looked around as though she owned the place and was checking for flaws. The flight attendant greeted her with a polite smile, but she brushed past without a word. She was already annoyed, already ready to find something that didn't meet her standards. When her eyes fell on me, sitting quietly in my seat, her entire expression hardened. She stopped, staring as if I were a stain on her perfect view of first class. Her nose wrinkled slightly, the way someone reacts when they catch a whiff of something unpleasant. Then, loud enough for several passengers nearby to hear, she said, "People like you shouldn't be sitting in first class." The words were sharp, cutting through the calm air of the cabin like a blade. For a moment, the hum of conversation around us stopped. A man in the row ahead turned his head slightly, his brows knitting. The elderly gentleman with shaky hands froze mid. Even the flight attendant standing nearby blinked, clearly startled. I felt their eyes on me, waiting. Some expected me to argue, others expected me to shrink back, but I did neither. I simply looked at her expression steady, not giving her the satisfaction of seeing anger or pain. Silence is powerful when used correctly, and in that silence, her words echoed louder than she realized. Her face flushed slightly, perhaps expecting me to react. When I didn't, she scoffed and moved past me to her seat, muttering under her breath about standards slipping these days. She thought she had put me in my place. She thought her words mattered. But they didn't. What mattered was what I knew, that my presence here had nothing to do with her approval and everything to do with the safety of this flight. The cabin slowly returned to normal. The businessmen went back to their tablets. The elderly man finally managed to stow his bag with the help of a kind attendant. The couple across the aisle exchanged quiet looks of disapproval toward the woman but didn't say anything. It wasn't their fight, and besides, most people in first class preferred to avoid conflict. I sat quietly, sipping the glass of water that had been handed to me, my mind as steady as ever. My job required more than physical readiness, it required emotional control. I couldn't let words rattle me. I couldn't let arrogance or ignorance throw me off balance. My focus had to remain sharp, my attention clear. Still, I couldn't deny the sting of her words, not because I believed them, but because I had heard them before in different forms, from different mouths, in different places. People often judged what they didn't understand. They measured worth by skin, by clothes, by appearances. They never looked deeper. They never guessed the truth. If she had known who I was, she would have held her tongue. If she had known that the very person she dismissed was the one tasked with keeping her safe, she might have chosen silence over scorn. But she didn't know, and I had no intention of telling her not yet. As the engines rumbled to life and the plane began to taxi down the runway, sunlight streamed brighter through the windows. Passengers leaned back, some closing their eyes, some scrolling through phones, some already dozing. The calm returned, wrapping the cabin in a blanket of quiet. I sat still, hands folded loosely in my lap, watching, waiting. The woman's insult was already fading into the background of my mind. There were more important things to pay attention to: movements, patterns, signs that might go unnoticed by others. My role wasn't to defend my pride. My role was to defend lives. And though she didn't know it yet, even the woman who thought I didn't belong in first class was under my protection. The engines roared as the plane surged forward, pressing everyone gently into their seats. Outside the window, sunlight painted the runway in golden streaks as the world blurred past. Then, with a smooth lift, the aircraft broke free from the ground and climbed steadily into the wide blue sky. The morning light spilled into the cabin, warming the faces of passengers who leaned back with relief. A few murmured prayers of thanks, a few closed their eyes, while others eagerly reached for magazines and devices. I kept my gaze steady, eyes sweeping the cabin, cataloging every detail. It was instinct now, something I did without thinking. The businessman in the front row ordered black coffee before the seatbelt sign even blinked off. The young couple across the aisle leaned close to each other, whispering with smiles. The elderly man behind me sighed in relief once the plane leveled, finally relaxing his grip on the armrest. To everyone else, these were ordinary passengers. To me, each action painted a picture I had to store away. And then, as expected, came the voice that sliced through the calm. "This seat isn't clean enough," the woman declared loudly, waving her manicured hand at a tiny speck on her armrest. A flight attendant hurried over, offering a napkin and a polite apology. But she wasn't done. "And the champagne, it's too warm. Do you even know how first-class service works?" Her words carried a sharpness designed to draw attention, and attention she received. A few passengers glanced her way, others buried themselves deeper in books and headphones, hoping to escape her presence. I didn't move, didn't react. I had seen people like her countless times, those who believed money bought them the right to belittle anyone in reach. She thrived on control, on the idea that the world existed to serve her. But entitlement has a way of revealing itself to everyone around it, and in her effort to look powerful, she only looked smaller. The attendant, still smiling politely, replaced her drink, wiped down her armrest, and moved on. The woman huffed dramatically, crossing her arms, her eyes darting across the cabin as though searching for the next floor to attack. Eventually, her gaze drifted back toward me. She studied me for a long moment, her lip curling slightly, but said nothing. Perhaps she thought her earlier words had done enough. I kept my face calm, but my senses remained sharp. My job wasn't to engage with her. My job was to read the rhythm of the flight, and something about today felt different. There was a subtle tension beyond her arrogance. A man a few rows down shifted too often in his seat, his eyes darting around instead of resting. Another passenger lingered in the aisle a moment longer than necessary before heading toward the restroom. They weren't out of line, not yet, but I had learned to trust my instincts. Trouble often made itself known in small ripples before it crashed in waves. The sunlight outside brightened as the plane cut through the clouds, filling the cabin with a soft, almost peaceful glow. But peace rarely lasted long when arrogance demanded attention. "Excuse me," the woman's voice rang again, pulling every eye back to her. This time she was glaring at the couple across the aisle. "Do you have to laugh so loudly? Some of us are trying to enjoy a premium experience here." The couple fell silent instantly, the woman's cheeks reddening as she lowered her gaze. The man gave a polite nod, clearly choosing to avoid conflict. But the embarrassment was etched on their faces, their joy stolen in seconds. The flight attendant returned quickly, her professional smile fixed in place. "Ma'am, they weren't being disruptive," she said softly. But the entitled passenger waved her hand dismissively. "Not disruptive to you, maybe, but to me, yes." She leaned back in her seat with the smugness of someone who thought she had won. I watched the couple's shoulders slump, watched their whispered conversation die out completely. A part of me wanted to step in, to defend them, but that wasn't my role, not yet. My responsibility was broader, heavier, and I couldn't allow myself to be distracted by every clash of ego. Still, I stored the moment away, because arrogance often grew bolder when left unchecked. For the next half hour, the flight settled into a quiet rhythm. Drinks were served, trays collected, and passengers relaxed into books, music, or simple silence. Even the entitled woman seemed momentarily satisfied, sipping her champagne and tapping at her phone. But my eyes kept moving, tracing the cabin's flow, noting the subtle shifts in body language. The man who had been restless earlier was at it again, his leg bouncing nervously, his eyes flicking toward the front of the plane too often. He wasn't dressed like a typical business travel. His clothes were slightly worn, his shoes scuffed, and his hands clenched tightly in his lap. He wasn't afraid of flying. Fear looks different. This was something else, impatience perhaps, or resolve. I logged the details, my senses narrowing on him even as I pretended to sip my water casually. Behind me, a faint cough drew my attention. The elderly man was fine, just clearing his throat, but his hands trembled again as he reached for a tissue. The attendant quickly brought him water, her kindness softening the sharpness the entitled passenger had left lingering in the air. The woman, of course, couldn't leave the moment alone. She glanced back at the old man and muttered, not quite quietly enough, "First class really isn't what it used to be." My jaw tightened slightly, but I stayed still. Words alone were not my battlefield, not yet. The flight continued smoothly, sunlight streaming through the cabin, engines humming steadily. But beneath the calm surface, I felt the undercurrent building. The woman's arrogance, the restless man's tension, the passenger's quiet unease, all of it swirled together into a storm that hadn't yet broken. I leaned back, appearing calm, but inside my mind sharpened into focus. My badge was hidden, my purpose concealed, but my role was clear. This plane, these passengers even, the ones who thought I didn't belong here, were under my protection. And soon, very soon, the difference between arrogance and real authority would be revealed. The cabin had settled into an uneasy rhythm, the kind of quiet that wasn't natural but forced. The entitled woman's sharp words still lingered in the air, leaving a thin layer of tension between the rows. The couple she had scolded barely spoke now. The elderly man stayed quiet, and most others pretended to be absorbed in books or screens. Only the hum of the engines and the occasional clink of glassware broke the silence. I stayed still, but my attention never drifted. My eyes tracked movements, my ears tuned into voices, my mind pieced together the subtle puzzle of behavior. Most passengers were just that, passengers, but the restless man a few rows away hadn't escaped me. He shifted constantly, tapping his fingers against his knees, glancing toward the front more often than anyone should. His breathing was shallow, his jaw tight. He wasn't nervous about flying, he was waiting for something. The flight attendants moved through the aisles with quiet efficiency, offering meals and drinks. They smiled, they reassured, they kept the cabin calm. But even they noticed him. I caught one attendant glancing at him longer than usual, her polite mask slipping for just a second before she moved on. She felt it too, that something wasn't right. Sunlight poured brightly through the windows, flooding the cabin with a warm glow. Outside, the world looked calm, endless blue sky stretching in every direction. But inside, the calm was thinning. Like glass about to crack, it happened fast. The man suddenly unbuckled his belt, rising from his seat with quick, determined steps. At first, it looked like he was heading to the restroom. But when he bypassed the aisle closest to it and pressed forward, my instincts ignited. His eyes were locked on the cockpit door, his shoulders tensed with purpose. This wasn't a passenger stretching his legs. This was something else, something dangerous. The flight attendants reacted first. "Sir, please return to your seat," one called, her voice steady but sharp with authority. The man didn't stop. He pushed past her with a force that knocked the tray she was carrying into the aisle, scattering cups and cutlery. Gasps rippled through the cabin. The elderly man behind me clutched his chest in fear. The couple across the aisle froze. "Wide dash, I dot." The entitled woman sprang up, pointing dramatically. "Do something. This is outrageous. We're in first class." Her voice carried panic disguised as anger. But she stayed rooted to her seat. I was already moving, my training erased hesitation. I slid out of my seat, stepping into the aisle with calm precision. To the passengers, it might have looked like I was just another man stepping forward. But every movement was measured, every second counted. I closed the distance quickly, intercepting him before he reached the cockpit. He shoved again, trying to muscle past me, but I caught his arm in a firm grip, twisting it just enough to break his momentum without causing unnecessary harm. His eyes widened as he realized I wasn't just another obstacle. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't shouting. I was in control. "Sit down," I said, my voice low but commanding. He struggled, jerking against my hold, but his movements were clumsy compared to mine. Years of training guided me, my strength precise, my balance unshaken. I shifted my weight, forcing him off balance, and within seconds I had him restrained against the aisle, his arm pinned. Gasps filled the cabin, passengers craning their necks to see. "Who are you?" he spat, his voice tight with anger and desperation. "Someone who won't let you through that door," I replied evenly. The flight attendants moved in quickly, their eyes wide but trusting as they saw the control I had. One of them handed me a pair of plastic restraints kept for emergencies. With practiced ease, I secured his wrists, locking them tight behind his back. He struggled a little more, but it was useless now. The fight had left him. The cabin fell into stunned silence. For a moment, the only sounds were the hum of the engines and the man's labored breathing. Passengers stared, some in fear, some in awe, some in relief. They had just seen the line between safety and danger, and they had seen who stood on the right side of it. The entitled woman broke the silence first. "Well, it's about time someone stopped him," she exclaimed loudly, as if she had been the one to call for action. Her eyes flicked toward me, narrowing as though she was trying to place me. She wanted to know who I was, why I had stepped in so confidently, why the attendants had handed me restraints without hesitation. But I didn't answer her. I guided the restrained man to an empty seat in the back of first class. Keeping my grip firm, the attendants worked quickly to secure him, buckling the seatbelt around his restrained form and positioning themselves nearby to watch him. His head hung low now, his defiance draining as he realized the attempt had failed. The passengers exhaled collectively, the tension breaking like a dam. Murmurs filled the cabin, some praising, some questioning, all buzzing with the aftermath of what they had witnessed. I returned to my seat calmly as though nothing had happened. To the outside world, I blended back in. But the truth had shifted. They had seen me act, seen the authority in my movements, seen that I wasn't just another passenger. The entitled woman stared at me, her lips parted slightly as though she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Her earlier insult, "People like you shouldn't sit in first class," hung in the air between us, now hollow and meaningless. She had seen what people like me were capable of, though she didn't yet know the full truth. The elderly man leaned forward, his voice shaky but sincere. "Thank you," he whispered, gratitude shining in his tired eyes. Others nodded quietly, their relief unspoken but clear. I gave a small nod in return, then leaned back into my seat. My heart rate was steady, my breathing calm. For me, it was just another moment of doing the job I had sworn to do. For them, it was the moment their flight and their lives had been protected. The engines hummed on, the sunlight poured in, and the plane continued its steady path across the sky. The cabin slowly returned to normal, though the quiet now carried a different weight. The passengers knew they were safe. They knew someone among them was more than he appeared. And though the entitled woman sat stiffly in her seat, her pride cracked and fragile, I didn't need her to apologize. The truth had already spoken louder than her words ever could. The cabin had gone strangely quiet after the outburst. It wasn't the relaxed silence of a normal flight anymore, it was the heavy quiet that follows a storm. The man I had restrained sat at the back of first class, wrists bound, his head bowed. Two attendants stayed near him, their polite smiles gone, replaced by watchful seriousness. Every passenger in that section kept sneaking glances in his direction, as though expecting him to explode again, but he didn't. He sat still, his breathing shallow, defeated for now. I leaned back in my seat, outwardly calm, though my mind stayed sharp. An attempt like that wasn't something to take lightly. Sometimes it was one person acting alone. Sometimes it was a distraction for something larger. My eyes moved steadily across the cabin, studying faces, searching for signs. A woman nervously twisting her wedding ring, a man dozing too deeply, a child crying softly into his mother's shoulder. Ordinary, all of them. Nothing else stood out. For the moment it seemed the danger had passed. Passengers began whispering again. A ripple of voices filled the air, cautious and hushed. "Did you see how fast he moved?" One man muttered. He stopped him like it was nothing. Another whispered, "Who is he?" I kept my expression neutral, though I caught the words. Their eyes kept darting back to me now, not just curious, but studying, piecing together what they had seen. To them, I wasn't just another passenger anymore, and then there was her. The entitled woman hadn't said much since the incident. She sat stiffly in her seat, her posture still proud, but her face betrayed the cracks. Her jaw was tight, her lips pressed into a thin line. She hadn't forgotten her earlier words, neither had I when her eyes flicked toward me. They didn't carry the same disdain as before. Now there was something else, confusion, suspicion, maybe even unease. At last, she spoke. How did you know what to do?" Her voice wasn't loud this time. It didn't carry that sharp edge of superiority. It was cautious, almost soft. I turned my head slowly, meeting her gaze. "I knew because it's my job to know," I said simply. Her eyebrows pulled together. "Your job?" Before I could reply, the flight attendant nearest us leaned in. She was young, her hand still trembling slightly from the encounter. "Ma'am," she said quietly to the woman, "he's an Air Marshal." The words dropped into the space between us like a stone into still water. A ripple passed through the cabin as nearby passengers heard. Some gasped softly, some sat straighter, and others turned to look at me with wide eyes of recognition. The truth was out now. The woman's eyes widened, her face paling. For a moment, she looked as though she might argue, as though the truth didn't fit into her carefully built world. But there was no arguing. She had seen me stop the man with her own eyes. She had seen the attendants hand me restraints without question. And now, with the title confirmed, she finally understood who she had insulted in Air Marshal. She repeated faintly, her voice stripped of arrogance. "Yes," the attendant replied firmly. "He's here to protect all of you." Silence settled again. The woman looked at me, but her pride kept her from speaking further. She wanted to take back her words. I could see it in her face, but an apology was a bridge too far for someone like her. Instead, she sank slightly into her seat, her jewelry glittering in the sunlight, her once powerful presence now strangely small. Around us, the whispers grew bolder. "That explains everything. No wonder he wasn't scared. We're lucky he was here." I stayed quiet, letting the passengers speak. I wasn't looking for gratitude. I wasn't looking for recognition. My role was never about being seen. But in that moment, I could feel the weight of their respect shift. They had judged me before by what they thought they saw. Now, they judged me by what I had done. The elderly man behind me leaned forward again, his voice stronger than before. "Son," he said, his eyes bright with sincerity. "I've flown many times in my life, but I've never felt safer than I do right now. Thank you." I gave him a small nod, the only acknowledgement I ever gave. His words weren't for me alone, they were for everyone listening. They were a reminder of what mattered, a reminder that respect isn't built on appearances but on actions. The entitled woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She wanted to speak, I could tell, but pride shackled her tongue. Finally, she let out a sharp exhale and muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. I didn't know. I looked at her steadily. "That's the point. You never know who people are, or what they're capable of. You should remember that." Her cheeks flushed, and she turned her head toward the window, unable to meet my eyes. For the first time since the flight began, she had no words. The rest of the cabin began to settle again. Drinks were quietly refilled, trays collected, and passengers eased back into their seats. But the energy was different now. They weren't just passengers anymore, they were a group who had shared a moment, who had seen danger come and go, and who now looked at each other with quiet recognition. The restrained man sat silently, his anger burning out, his fight gone. He avoided my gaze, staring instead at the floor. Whatever he had planned, it was over now. I leaned back, my focus still sharp but my body calm. The job wasn't finished until we landed, but the hardest part was behind us. The cabin was safe again. The sunlight outside poured in brighter, reflecting across the clouds below. For a brief moment, it almost felt peaceful again. The entitled woman didn't speak another word for the rest of the flight. She sat in her expensive clothes, surrounded by the luxury she believed made her important. But she couldn't shake what had happened. Her earlier insult echoed back at her, not in my voice but in her own memory. People like you shouldn't sit in first class. Now, she knew the truth. People like me weren't just passengers. We were the reason people like her arrived safely at all. And though she would never admit it out loud, I could see it in the way her eyes avoided mine, in the way her hands fidgeted with the clasp of her handbag. She understood. The lesson wasn't for me, it was for her. And whether she liked it or not, the truth had humbled her. The hours that followed passed slowly, but the tension that had once gripped the cabin gradually loosened. The restrained man remained in his seat at the back of first class, his wrists still bound, his anger reduced to silence. 2 attendants kept watch, their posture professional but guarded. They no longer needed to ask questions about me. They knew who I was, and that was enough. The passengers began to relax again, though their eyes would occasionally flick toward me, as if reminding themselves that the danger had passed because of my presence. Some gave me small nods when I met their gaze, unspoken gratitude in their expressions. Others avoided eye contact altogether, still processing what had happened. Everyone reacted differently. But one thing was certain, the cabin no longer saw me as just another traveler. The entitled woman stayed quiet. The arrogance she had carried onto the plane was gone, replaced by something she couldn't mask. She fiddled with her jewelry, checked her phone though there was no signal, and stared out the window as though the endless sky might distract her from her own thoughts. Every so often her eyes drifted toward me, and then quickly away. She had wanted to make me feel small with her words, but now, she was the one shrinking into silence. The sunlight outside began to shift, angling lower as the plane neared its destination. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for landing. Thank you for flying with us today." A soft murmur passed through the cabin. Passengers adjusted their seats, stowed their belongings, and braced for the familiar drop in altitude. The engines changed tone as the plane descended, and the once bright sunlight turned softer, painting the clouds in pale shades of gold. I checked the restrained man one last time. He sat slumped, defeated, with no fight left in him. The attendants remained at their posts, though their shoulders eased slightly now that the landing was near. Everything was under control. As the wheels touched down with a steady thud, a collective sigh filled the cabin. Land always felt safer than sky, even if danger existed in both. The plane slowed, the runway rushing past the windows, and finally rolled to a calm stop near the gate. The seatbelt sign chimed off, and almost immediately passengers reached for bags, eager to escape the confinement of the flight. But this wasn't a normal landing. The restrained man would be taken into custody the moment the doors opened. The attendants had already discreetly contacted the authorities on the ground, ensuring law enforcement would be waiting. Passengers, meanwhile, prepared to disembark with a mixture of relief and hushed conversations. The elderly man behind me leaned forward one last time, his voice filled with warmth. "You've done more than your duty today, son. God bless you." I gave him the same small nod as before. "Safe travels," I said quietly, and he smiled, as though those words meant more than any long speech could. The young couple across the aisle offered me grateful looks. The woman, who had been silenced earlier by the entitled passengers scolding, mouthed a silent thank you before looking away shyly. And then there was her. The entitled woman stood slowly, her handbag clutched tightly, her chin raised, as though trying to salvage what little pride she had left. But her face betrayed her. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the raw truth of what she had witnessed. She glanced at me one last time, her lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. She wanted to apologize, perhaps, or maybe she wanted to explain herself. But pride was a stubborn chain, and it kept her silent. For a moment, our eyes met. I didn't need her apology. The truth had already taught her more than my words ever could. Her judgment had been stripped bare in front of everyone, and no amount of money, jewelry, or expensive tickets could shield her from that. She looked away quickly, and in that simple motion, the battle she had tried to fight earlier was over. She had lost. The door to the plane opened, and a rush of cool air spilled inside. One by one, passengers filed out, some pausing to thank the attendants, others simply eager to leave. As the entitled woman walked past the restrained man at the back, she flinched slightly, reminding herself of the danger she had mocked others for fearing. I waited until most had disembarked before standing. My bag rested lightly in my hand. My movements were unhurried, deliberate, as though this had been just another flight. In many ways, it had. This was the nature of my work, ordinary days, punctuated by extraordinary moments that I stepped off the plane. I saw law enforcement officers waiting, their presence calm but firm. They moved past me, heading straight for the restrained man. The attendants guided them quickly, and within minutes he was in their custody. Justice would continue on the ground now. I walked into the terminal, blending back into the stream of travelers. To them, I was invisible again, just another man with a bag, moving through the airport. No one outside that cabin would ever know what had happened, and that was fine by me. My job wasn't about recognition. It was about protection. Behind me, the entitled woman walked with her usual grace, her heels clicking on the polished floor. But she didn't look at me this time. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, her pride too bruised to risk another glance. The lesson she had received would stay with her far longer than this flight. I moved on, disappearing into the crowd, ready for the next flight, the next challenge, the next day of silence and vigilance. Because that was the truth of being an air marshal. The world rarely noticed you until the moment it needed you most. And when that moment came, there was no room for pride, for prejudice, or for judgment. There was only action. And action, as always, spoke louder than words.